What'd you say?
When it comes to like ethnicities here, has there been people where like if they were Caucasian, they literally
Oh yeah.
came up just straight up Caucasian on all their responses?
It's all bell curves.
Yeah.
There's some that match and some that don't.
Really?
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. There's some, if you notice, there's some that have little specks, little.
Little dot. Well,
Yeah.
I did that dot, but yeah.
Oh, okay. It means that there's a lot of variation just within that one cluster.
Yeah, like the Southern Asian one.
Right.
For this one.
Yeah. All right. Let's keep pressing on. I'll give you a break in just a moment. All right. All right, so doing versus being. This is just exactly what it says. And it's all about meeting goals, achievement, versus quality of the relationship, quality of life. Okay? And you have some very being-oriented people in this room. But they're not alone. They're not outliers. Who are the being-oriented people? Yeah. And so if things are getting too hectic, right, and you feel like things are just moving too fast, and you know there's stress and there's strain and all that stuff, how are the being people, what are they going to say to try to get you to slow down? The being people don't answer yet. What are the doing people, the people that are high doing task oriented, what do you think the being people would try to tell you? How would they say it?
Slow down.
Besides just slow down.
I can reevaluate what we're saying.
Yeah, can we take a step back? What else?
Just chill. Just stop talking.
Yeah. Can we have more fun together, right? Can we laugh more together? Those are your cues that the being people are what? They're sensing something about the relationships that are happening, and they need to work on the quality of the relationship as opposed to achieving the task. So what happens, being people? Tell us when you're trying to communicate that. What happens when you do it?
I think I'm the 26 and my husband is the 98.
So what does it take to get your 98 husband to stop?
I don't know. Maybe like 15 years. A lot of conversations.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So we're also different on this. I tend to be more of a being person. He tends to be more of a doing person. And for me, I found like I have to logic him into like having stuff. So like the basic example for me is like how our kids are raised. Because like for me, like, my mom was the type of person that took us out of school because it was a pretty day. And so I'm always like, oh, like mental health day, we're gonna go to the zoo. And that's like, they go to school today. Like this is what we do. And so I usually have to kind of find like a scientific, logical reason of like why this is actually a good decision. And then he'll go along with me.
That's good, yes.
I usually, again, thinking like in my work, try to change the metric that we're looking at of like, because I'm a teacher, so I'm like, okay, well the test scores are all great, but like the kids are fighting all day and they're crying all day, so like maybe we should focus on that and like focus on a different metric of success to look at it this way.
Yeah. The same thing happens in your small groups too, right? There's people that are very much being oriented and that are a lot more concerned about the relational content of the group rather than just doing another Bible study. Nothing wrong with Bible study, you know, but it depends on how the Bible study is being taught. Is it just information? Is it just another thing we can check off? Do we have to get past a certain point? Can we just see how we're doing with each other? You know, and especially depending on where they're coming from, You know, that's such an important thing. It's like, no, we're starting at 6:30 and we're ending at 8. Well, what if we're having a really good discussion and we're just starting to get into it? Sorry, it's time to leave. You know, and the being-oriented people, half of them will be offended at that, all right? They're like, that was so unfulfilling, you know? So those are things to recognize and just be aware of. And especially, you know, even in the race issue, a lot of times when I go to these churches, depending on the church, but especially the ones that tend to be, you know, kind of suburban and clustered and kind of off to themselves in that bubble, you know what they always ask me? Just tell me what to do to be culturally competent, to be, you know, just give me a list. And it's equivalent to in a marriage situation where the wife leaves and the husband comes to me broken and is like, just give me a list of things to do to win her back. And I always say the same thing. I could give you a list of 10,000 things you would run out and not stop doing it until you had all 10,000 checked, but she still wouldn't come back. Because she's not wanting you to do anything. She's wanting you to be somebody, you know. And that's so many of the things that's missing when we're talking about this whole welcoming of others. It's not so much do everything. There was a church one time, the guy was like, can you just give me something I can whiteboard for my staff that would make our church more welcoming? And he was sitting right next to a young Latino man who is on his staff. And I said, hey, Joel, why is it that more people from your community don't come to your church? And he said, warmth. When we walk in the door, we don't care if, you know, the slides are 2 seconds behind the lyrics. We don't care if everything's excellent. We just want to know you're glad we're here. And I said, okay, whiteboard that. You can't do it, right? Because it's like being something, not doing something. Anyway, let me keep pressing on. This one, I wish we had more time to spend on it, because this is the one that can be really divisive. This is rule keeping versus rule bending. Okay? The rule keepers are what's called universalists, and not the spiritual term. This means that they universally apply to rules at everybody, no exceptions. Okay? And you see you have some, that's as rule keeping as you get, right there. That's 3. But on the other end, you have the 98, and they're always looking for a reason to break the rules. Right? Look at what particularism says. It says there are specific, unique standards based on relationships. You know what that sounds like to me? Relativism. Right? So in one end, if you're not careful on this universalism side, you can tend towards legalism. But on the particularism side, you can tend towards favoritism and relativism. And so this is where, look exactly where the average is. Right in the middle, which is amazing. That's a very, very powerful thing. But what do you think these two are going to disagree with when it comes to how are we going to interpret the scriptures regarding this hot topic? You know?
They're going to disagree on everything.
Yeah, they're going to disagree on a lot of things. And this is where, generationally, I see the biggest gaps. Because usually the leadership is way over here on the universal side. They're trying to protect the mission and the vision of the organization. So they hardline based on who they've been. And like the younger people coming in are way off, 30 points off to the right of where the leadership is. And there's just a big, big disconnect between what's being said, how the organization is run, and what people actually believe. And I bet if we were to take that poll, on a variety of subjects, any of the controversial ones, you would have a very wide spectrum of opinions just in this room. And so you need to understand, how are you going to communicate that in your small groups when these issues come up that would be respectful for who the church is? And that's a very complicated discussion.
You have to know what the church is.
Yeah, you have to know what the church is, you have to know the mission well, and you...
Where the leadership stands on all these things.
Exactly. Spoken as an elder of the church, right? But this is the kind of discussions that need to be happening where the elders and the people, the laity and the people, all the people in between need to have these discussions around a meal, framing the conversation where it's like, hey, we're part of the same body. Can we figure out how we're going to talk about these things? And we talk about it with great nuance, with great understanding about who's coming in the room, who's around the table, and you start making progress as opposed to just ignoring it and hoping it doesn't ever happen. Because chances are it's already happening in your small groups, and it's already coming up in your small groups, and you're feeling ill-prepared to know how to even begin talking about it. Yes?
So we had a new couple join our community group recently. Fantastic. I go to North, and we've had an influx of diversity. When you said like, oh, you guys are very diverse group, you're not in the suburbs, we're in the suburbs, we're North Raleigh, we're very homogenous. But we have this new couple that joined, and they asked a question about some closed-fisted things because they come from a very different religious background. And so how they're very different from their religious upbringing, as well as their just, I don't remember where their families are from, but they're also Hispanic. So how do we communicate something that they were asking? They needed their answer to be a bench rule for something that we're very close-fisted on.
Mm-hmm.
How do we do that?
Yeah, that's a good...
Yeah. Okay. So they were asking, her brother is gay,
Mm-hmm.
and they were completely outcast from their church when she was young. Her entire family was. And so she was asking, what is our church's stance on homosexuality? And then she was kind of bracing for us to say, you're not welcome here, which of course is not how we would welcome her into the family. So that's what it was.
Yeah, well, first of all, notice the experience and the cultural dynamics. Were they in a different country when that happened?
No.
Okay. But notice, like, the brother was gay, and yet the entire family was castigated, you know, just cast away from the church. So that says something about just the way they were viewing family and all of that together. And they were hoping to find some level of nuance with this church with regard to, so am I going to get kicked out of this church too? Because I still love my brother. He's still my brother. So how do you handle all of that? You know, and that's again, we don't have the time to talk about that today because we could spend an entire day talking about that issue.
Can we hire you to come back to talk about that?
Sure, I guess. But what I would say is, you know, is what I would say to the people that come into our church. Number one, the most important thing you can do is just be as diverse as you can across as many different ways as you possibly can. Because what I was just talking about yesterday is the fact that the whole sexuality discussion is one of about 50 different axes of, you know, spectrums that we are dealing with on a daily basis at the church, because we're dealing with 30 countries, we're dealing with, you know, homelessness and affluence and Republicans and Democrats, and it's all kinds of social dynamics. And so just about every issue that America is arguing about today, we constantly are working with people in our church. And so the sexuality issue is just one of many. And it's all handled the same way from our perspective. We always just say, hey, Christ is number one. This is the non-negotiable. We lift him up as high as we can. Our unity as believers is number two. It's a clear number two, but it's orders of magnitude below putting Christ where he deserves. And then number three is everything else. Okay, and it's doctrinal, it's social, it's political, it's sexual. And what we say is like, if you come to the church and you're willing to worship in a room with people that you know disagree with you, you'll love this place. Okay? But if you have an agenda and that number three issue, whatever it might be, if it's before or after your name, you put, I'm a blank Christian or a Christian blank. Whatever you fill in that blank, if you feel like everybody needs to be that way and it starts impinging on the unity of the church, you probably should find some other place to worship. We're asking you to self-deny for the sake of the body of Christ. Okay? It's harder. It's a harder ask for some people, and in the sexuality world, the LGBT community, that's almost unheard of, that you would ask them to self-deny who they are for the sake of the unity of the body. And it's like I was saying, it's also it's that hard for some Republicans, and it's that hard for some Democrats, but not all. Okay? And like one of my favorite stories is like when, we have some of the staunchest Republicans and some of the staunchest Democrats in our church. And when the first news leaked that the Supreme Court was overturning Roe versus Wade, the first guy that texted me was our staunch Republican. And he said, "Did you see this?" And I thought it was a joke. I was like, there's no way that really happened. He goes, "I'm really grieving over this." And I called him up and said, "Ralph, you're like the top of the Arkansas Republican committee thing here in the state, in one of the most conservative states about abortion. Why are you grieving? Haven't you been praying for this for, 40, 50 years or whatever?" And he was like, "Yes," he said, "but it's just another way for Satan to divide the church." And I was like, God bless you. That's why he is at Mosaix. Other Republicans would have just been posting it. Ha, 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 God finally delivered, and just using it as a way to divide even further. So, I don't know if that answered your question or not, but hopefully that gives you some kind of like ways to approach those topics and ways that you can start discussing some of this. Yeah.
Okay. I guess a question on top of her question, on top of what you're sharing, it's like ice cream cone, is in these discussions, like there is a right versus wrong in the Bible. And so it's, from what I'm hearing from you, it's how we talk about it with people, like with the man that was like the Republican, like we should not kill children in the womb.
Right.
That is a right or wrong issue, but the heart behind it, like the way that he shared that is like, is that what you're saying? Like with her friends, the people in the community group, like we are going to share like what we believe is right versus wrong, but it is the way that you, like your heart behind it. Is your heart behind it like this malice, or is your heart behind it like, yes, it's a right versus wrong, but it's because like we want you to be full in Christ. Like,
yeah, I would say ultimately what people are looking for is like the same thing that the woman that was caught in adultery found in Christ. Like he didn't excuse anything, he didn't make it right to go sleep with other people, but he did not condemn. Right. He did not say, yeah, you're unusable, you should be stoned. Right? And that's usually the answer that people are waiting to hear from us. When they're coming in wounded like that. Are you going to condemn me too? And it's just like what Christ said, where's all your condemners? And he was like, well, I don't condemn you. Now go and sin no more. And so that's just a different approach in some of these issues. Let me keep going, because otherwise we'll be here forever. And I need to, is anybody, if you need a break, just take it, okay? And I'll just keep going, because we still got so much to cover, just a little bit of time. This is the other really important one on conflict resolve. Okay, this is how expressive are you going to be? And again, you got like the entire spectrum in this room. And so resolving a conflict with everybody in here would be very challenging. This is your second highest standard deviation out of the 10. And you see why, right? You got end to end, the person on the 3 that's very neutral, can you guess who it is?
Lamar?
No, it's the person that's most reserved. Who is it? You can raise your hand. Right? And so, what is your name?
Sale.
Okay.
Sail like a boat.
Okay. So, and I hope it's okay if I talk about you for a minute. Okay. So if things are heated and you're in the discussion and things start getting heated and somebody starts being expressive and they're trying to resolve something with Sale and they start raising their voice and start getting animated, what do you think Sale's going to do?
Shut down.
Yeah, he's just not going to respond in that moment. Which, who's the 98? All right. And so, and what? Tell me your name again.
Kenny.
Kenny, okay. So if Kenny, who you never have to worry about what Kenny's feeling, right? Is he wears it on his face, he wears it on his sleeve, it's just there. And so when he is in a conflict, he's going to let you know exactly, he's going to express it, and when, in this case, when Sale shuts down or is not responding, what are you going to do?
I would be like, what's going on?
Yeah, and more than likely that's going to frustrate you, right? Because in your world, if you're not passionate about it, you're not authentic about the conflict. There's nothing wrong with being expressive in the moment of a conflict. It's just whether or not that expressiveness becomes, where it becomes abusive or it becomes cussing and offenses happen. But you can be passionate about it. But in some cultures, if you're not passionate about it, it discredits your argument altogether, right? Right? If you're not going to be willing. But in other cultures, if you lose it emotionally, it discredits your argument.
Also, if women lose it more often than men, they're also discredited.
Yeah, a lot of times that's happened so many different places, right? Where if a woman becomes emotional, the guys are like, oh no, what do we do now? And so all of that is just being comfortable with the different expressions of conflict without assigning it to, oh, they're just too volatile, I'm never going to try to resolve something with them. Or, no, they're just a killjoy, don't ever try to share something with them because they won't ever respond one way or the other. Whereas you need them both at various times. And so where it needs to be healthy is when they can be themselves, talk about things, whether it be animated, non-expressive, and get to a point of feeling like things are resolved. It may not feel comfortable, but what's important is the way the things are resolved. True story. A major conflict in our church just this last year between two very direct people. I made them both do CQ after all this happened. Incident Sunday morning, one guy got cussed out. And he was the super expressive one. He lost it because the emotionally neutral one just stood there and didn't respond. And he just kept getting louder and louder, and eventually he said things he shouldn't have said. But they were both direct. So what do you think happened?
quickly resolved.
It was quickly resolved?
That's what I think.
How was it quick? How would you think it would be quickly resolved?
I think if they're both direct, they're both, I don't know. Clearly I'm wrong here. So.
They avoided each other.
Yeah, so one ended up cussing out the other just stood there and didn't respond, just shut down. So what do you think happened after that? Yeah, made the direct person, expressive person more angry. The other person just walked off. Okay, what happened after that? What do you think would happen after that? Yeah, they avoided each other. They're both direct. What do you think the non-expressive person did? You remember, he's direct. Yeah. Right. He went home, thought about it, took the whole next day off. He was so upset by it. And then he sent like a 10-page email to me and all the pastors accusing that guy of being a racist. You know, he was first gen from Mexico, so there was all of that going on. And he wanted a meeting with the elders, you know. The other guy was just like, you know, he does professional production. He's always in the heat of the moment trying to get things done, and he's always cussing people out, unfortunately. He works the church as a side gig, and so, you know, having to sit down with both of them and saying, number one, you guys are more alike than you think you are, and you should see what this guy wrote about you and sent to me and all of the elders of the church about you. And when he heard that, he just was like, I am so sorry. He knew he blew it. Right, but it took a long time. I made them both do CQ. They both had to meet with me for 2 sessions. And then we had to come together, and then there were apologies made, and the relationship restored. But it took a lot of work, right? And just understanding that about the way people express emotion is very, very important. Because in one way, you know, like I said, you lose it, it discredits one world. If you express it, if you don't express it, you lose in another world. All right, and then the last one is all about linear versus nonlinear. This has some punctuality in it, right? Because the people that are super linear are usually the ones that are really in order and on time, and the ones that tend to be, you know, multitaskers are doing so many different things, and they're very rarely on time. This also has to do with how much work and personal life can overlap, because the linear people tend to be very structured in allowing those two worlds to intersect, and the nonlinear people are so busy doing so many things that it's just another thing to be at home and get text message, you know. And you can usually separate the two by how they respond to all the group texts, you know, going around. So if you have a group meet with all the small group leaders on it, and you guys are laughing and liking every text and everything like that, and it's 8:30 at night, the nonlinear polychronic people on that end are going, I love this group of people, they're so fun, ha 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 ha. And the linear people are over there going, how can I get out of this thread, right? And it's like, please quit liking everything, don't heart one more message, please. You know, and so just bear in mind all that. And so that is the 10. If you can memorize those 10, are any of their personality buffs in here? They love the Enneagram, they love the DISC test. This is just a more sophisticated way of doing personalities for larger groups of people. And so if you really like all of that stuff with personalities, memorize these 10 cultural values and start using it to help predict the way people are going to respond in certain situations. It really does work. It's the #1 tool I use the most in producing this crazy, diverse church. But what all they do is it shows you general orientation. It also shows you potential biases. We could spend a whole nother workshop just going through these 10 and talking about what are the potential implicit biases that come out when people are dealing with each other across these divides. All right, so we've talked a lot. I would like to give you more of a breakout, but I only got 40 minutes left. Can I just keep going?
Keep going.
All right, yeah, you guys have been interacting with me well. So let's look at the actual capabilities. This is in the front of your report. Now this section is so different than the last one. This one is everybody we want to move into the orange over time. Okay, the orange represents the highest 25% of worldwide norms, and usually you can't get into the orange without intentionality. Okay, that's why you can usually tell if your worldwide norms, it's pretty much meaning that you haven't had any intentional training in these areas. But kind of like what Dan was saying about, you know, his job and the way he's been trained to think about communicating in certain situations, that's very high CQ. And I'm sorry.
Sorry, I thought you were just saying which one, action.
Yeah, on the action score. And so where we're headed, trying to move everybody to the right into the orange. You've self-assessed yourself, right? So this is the way you think you are. Sometimes that can be dependent on how tired you are, how rushed you were when you took the test, how self-aware you are, all of those things, right? There's another one that's called the CQ 360 where a bunch of friends answer those questions about you, and then you compare their answers to your answer, and that's a very eye-opening exercise, right? But for the most part, you know, the self-directed one is as accurate as a personality test because you're answering all those same questions about yourself in those as well. So let's look at the first one, which is drive. And this is measuring, again, how motivated you are as a group. Notice that you're pretty much at worldwide norms, slightly above overall in your drive, which is, it's good that, and it's not a bad place to be. And the intrinsic interest is high. You're almost into the orange as a group. That means that all of you really do enjoy encountering and engaging other people. You derive a lot of enjoyment out of that personally. Okay, that's a very good thing. Keep working on that. Put yourselves in those situations where it forces you to be uncomfortable and then will yourself to really enjoy those moments. It's like, you know, the first time I got invited to a quinceañera, which is, you know, in the Hispanic community, it's where 16-year-old girls became our celebration of womanhood. It's a very, very cultural event. And the first time I got invited, I couldn't understand what was going on. The food was really spicy, you know, and so by the time it was all over though, and I walked out of there, I just thought, man, I am the world's most blessed pastor. When can I get invited to another one of those? You know, because it was such a beautiful experience of just expression of culture that helped me understand more about the brothers and sisters in my church. And so those are the kinds of things, if you walk out of there and go, man, that was a waste of time, nobody talked to me, couldn't even understand them, didn't like the food, it's a waste of my time, that would be low intrinsic interest. Okay, so find those places where you can keep willing yourself to enjoy those moments, you know, and keep doing it. You will win many people if you keep showing up to those things and just having a good time. Extrinsic interest, this is benefits gained from understanding how important this is. That score is a little bit low to me for this group. maybe there's any hesitation around that. Maybe there's some feeling maybe there would be compromise on mission or value. That's where all of this needs to be really well clarified and solidified theologically, missionally, organizationally, and know how important it is for the overall church and for you personally to benefit from being effective in this role. It'll help your small groups, it'll help the church at large. And so again, those are things that you should just keep working on. And then the self-efficacy, I like this score because it matches the other two. Where I get concerned is where that score is a lot higher than the other two. And I've seen plenty of those. That means that people are way overconfident in their abilities. And especially with your action score, if you had a super high confidence score, which is that self-efficacy score, if you had a super high score in that but low action, I would know you're the kind that's likely to stick their foot in their mouth, right? Because you're overconfident, undertrained in those situations. And so as you improve those interactions and you have more success and you're building better relationships with diverse others, that score will get higher and higher.
I have a question, Harry.
Yeah.
Real quick. If someone finds themselves in the lower extrinsic, how could someone build value, or how can they begin to see the value that they're going to gain from being in those relationships?
Yeah, there's one is to keep asking yourself why. Why should I do this? Okay, and the reasons, hopefully we've already covered a lot of them, because you want to be the most effective instrument that God has called you to be, to the greatest number of people. You want to influence the greatest number of people. You want to be the one that God uses to help others, to minister to others, to help love others. That's the main reasons why. And once you become confident with those reasons, then you can start throwing yourself into those situations, and see how beneficial it is. Yeah. If you want to know the passage of scripture I turn to the most for CQ, it's this one. It's Paul's passage in 1 Corinthians where he's talking about, even though I'm free from all, I've made myself a servant to all. This is CQ at its finest. I mean, look at why he does it all. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. That's the greatest motivation for Paul. And notice who he says he becomes. I became like the Jews so I could win the Jews. I became like the people under the law so I could win those that were stuck like I was under the law. I became as those outside the law so that I could win those outside of the law. How far was I willing to go? As far as Christ would let me go. I became to the weak as those, I became weak so I could win the weak. Who are the weak? They're the powerless. That's what that word means. They're the reds. They're the people sitting out there asking for food. I do it all for the sake of the gospel. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might win the more. That's incredible CQ. If everybody just studied that passage and lived this out, even though you're free from all, you've made yourself a servant to all. That would completely revolutionize the churches in America.
What I love the way he said about it in 23 is, it's not that I might let them have the blessings that they can, sort of enjoy it in their own circle, but it's actually to share with them in its blessings.
Yeah.
I want to bring them in, not just give it to them so they can have it over there and
Right.
not have to interact.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And notice how many times he uses the word win and who he's winning. He's winning the person. He's not winning the argument. You know? On the knowledge side, go to the next one. What's important about this one, you guys are good with values and norms. That's a very good starting place. It shows that you're highly aware. You're almost in the top 25% in terms of understanding the way diverse others view family and the norms and all that stuff. The business, remember, this was really created for business people, so unless you're negotiating and interacting internationally, you don't necessarily need to know a lot about the business aspects of that. But the sociolinguistics part is, it's an average score, right? And that's important, especially if you're going to be attracting any first generation immigrant groups. And especially, I keep hounding and pounding this topic, pronouncing names, okay? And pronouncing them correctly, learning how to say them, not butchering them, not making fun of them. And you know where it's most offensive when you make those kinds of mistakes? Not the person, really. It's usually their spouse. Right? They're the ones that get really mad. I hate it when people do that to my spouse, because it's like, don't they even want to make an effort, you know, to get to know me and my spouse, and they can't even pronounce the name right? So those are the kinds of things, no language, syntax, translation issues, those are all come into play if you have a lot of first-gen immigrant groups coming into the church. The leadership one, again, that's the big one, right? That's where what this score says is that you're used to the one style. You haven't had a ton of exposure to other kinds of leaders. So what you should do is, instead of measuring leaders based on what you preconceived as the model leader, right? Break that down, deconstruct that model, and just ask, let's see, they don't really have lion types like in Mexico, they were all golden retrievers. How did those effective leaders lead? And that should be valued. That's a form of leadership. Go to Southeast Asia. I can guarantee you they're not lions, and they're probably not even golden retrievers. They're different, quiet leadership, you know, a lot more thoughtful and introspective. And so leadership just looks different from culture to culture to culture. The more you understand it, the more you can empower it, appreciate it, and help others get elevated because of their leadership, not because of the model that you've already imposed or have preconceived for everybody. Notice what Paul says, I became as, I became as, I became as, I became as. He couldn't become as if he didn't know. This is where you really need to know history. Like, why is Raleigh the way it is? Why is it segregated the way it is? There's probably people still living from the impacts of stuff that happened generations ago. You know, Little Rock's known for the Little Rock Nine. We still have members of our church that are brothers and sisters, siblings of the Little Rock Nine. I mean, it's still in play. And the thing I would say, especially for you all, and especially for the younger group that comes in, and most of them are saying, you know, I don't get why we're still even talking about this. Why is this still an issue? And the best thing you could say to the younger people that are doing that is, well, you need to understand that for some of the older people, there was a lot of trauma. I mean, just deep racialized trauma. When churches are getting blown up in the 50s, you know, and people are getting lynched in downtown Little Rock, and I mean, this was the worst lynching in Little Rock's history was 50 years ago, maybe 60 years ago. No, it was the 30s. So it's 80 years ago, or however, whatever my math is. But it was so traumatic, and they burned the bodies downtown, very well-known intersection, downtown Little Rock, and they raided the African American church and tore all the pews out and used the pews to burn the bodies. So what are the implications of that on the church and the city? So those are the kinds of things you just need to be aware of, because that's the kind of racialized trauma that people still deal with, that if you just say, so why can't you get over that? When it was your family member that was treated that way. And we all have trauma. We all have certain degrees of woundedness. And when you're wounded like that and it's not resolved, you even hear anything that even sounds like it, and it makes you run. So that's why it's important to know and understand. Was there a question back there? Okay. All right, so know all that stuff as best you can. Another really big one that I see in the church today is media and news. Okay? If you have people that only listen to Fox News or only listen to MSNBC, they're living on different planets, And really encourage your people with the question, who's discipling you? If you listen to 5 hours of Tucker Carlson every night, every day, or every week, or 5 hours of Rachel Maddow every week, and you come to church and you get a 40-minute sermon, who are you trusting in, right? I mean, really, it's like, I try to read a lot of different news from a lot of different sources, and I'm the engineer type, so I'm just constantly filtering data in my mind, and many of you are probably the same way. And I'm just throwing out what I know is propaganda, throwing out what I know is as much to the best I can bias, and I can usually tell what channel people are listening to by the words they use. And this issue has caused a huge rift in the church in America. And so the more you can get people to recognize the echo chambers that they're listening to and how different, that's why it's important for you to know all these different perspectives, so that when you hear those dogmatic statements, you can be the one that says, I don't necessarily agree with this, but I understand it, and here's the way I think the others perceive this issue. Then you can be the balancing force of those kinds of volatile discussions and help bring some level of, again, understanding. Strategy. This is where you're actually thinking ahead, you're planning, you're questioning your assumptions, you're checking yourself. This is the metacognitive part, and the score you do need to work on is planning. So if you have a new member is coming to your group, they're diverse, do everything you can to plan ahead. Go through the values in your head, think about what you might know, think about good questions, think about the assumptions you're making about the people. You could spend hours just talking about what are the assumptions we're making about the people coming into the small groups? Because there's probably a lot of them around education, around socioeconomics, around theology. And just having those kinds of questions in your head will help you prepare for those encounters. Again, look at Paul again. He's like, his strategy was to win the person. Draw them into the conversation, into the discussion, instead of repel them. All right, then the last one is the action score. And the speech acts, again, this is what we were just talking about. If you can be cognizant of your own directness or indirectness and how to temper that in the moment, depending on who's in the room, will make you very, very powerful in this one capability. Okay, it's understanding body language, facial expressions, having the look, your smile, whether or not your smile is genuine or not, eyebrow flashes, all that stuff is so important. You know, this is the stuff that's like, you know, they say, unfortunately, we as human beings, we first meet somebody, there's 1,000 processes happening in the back of our mind, and we're already deciding whether or not they're in or they're out or it's undecided, right? That's just human nature. A lot of times it's wrong. And so this is the part where you are the person that understands others are perceiving you based on your body posture, based on your facial expressions, eye contact. And you know that you are doing everything you can so that they're not going to say you're out. Okay? And also it's the way you now see others coming to you and you're going, yeah, they're out. But instead you're going, oh man, how can I win this person and make them in? You know, those are the kinds of things this does. Now, the nonverbal is the hardest one, and this was your lowest score, right? That means you're not used to thinking about body language. But it is so important because most, especially many cultures of the world, that's the main way they communicate, is not with words, but by, you have to read the body and what's it saying. And this was like a mystery to me when I first started, right? It was like I didn't even know what that meant. And you want to see my first CQ score? There it is. Look at my nonverbal. I bet I'm lower than anybody else in the room. I've been pastoring Mosaix for over 10 years. And you know, my friend Amos and I got into it one time, and he said, you have a look. And when you look at me, you make me feel like you think you're better than me. I mean, we got into a big argument about that. I'm like, what does that even mean? I don't even know what that look is. And he goes, I don't even know how to describe it. I just, when you're talking to me, I just feel like you think you're better than me. And I was like, I don't know what that means. And I don't even know how to process that. All I knew is I was mad. And when I went home and I told my wife that Amos said I had a look, and that it was offensive to him, you know what she said, right?
Oh, that look.
Just like what you would say to your husband if he come home and told you that. You would say, yeah, I know that look. And I'm like, please, somebody tell me what is this look? And her next words were like death inside of me. It was like, well, when your dad was alive, you know, she said, he used to lecture us when he would talk to us, and he'd kind of look out the top of his glasses and kind of wave his finger, just think, first generation immigrant Chinese man. That was my dad. And she said, and sometimes I see that in you. And I just died on the inside, right? It wasn't long when I was doing this, when I was just trying to figure out what this even meant, and we had the chief of police in Little Rock come to visit Mosaix, and it was my job to introduce him. And so I brought him up and I said, hey, this is the new chief of police, Chief Buckner. We're going to pray for him. I handed him the mic and he spoke. And on Tuesday, the video guy came and said, I want you to see the thumbnail the computer picked out for your segment with Chief Buckner. And here it is. And that's when I was like, oh, this stuff really does matter, doesn't it? Body language says something. And I went back and watched the video about 10 times. And it happened literally this fast. It was like, welcome, Chief. Hey, say a few words to us. I handed the mic, and then I went like this. And that's where it caught me. You can see back then, I was wearing those kinds of glasses you could look out the top of, right? I was doing this a lot. Have you seen me cross my arms? No. Yeah, There's a reason for that, because of that. I went to our cultural version, I was like, I don't even know what this means, but you gotta help me. So the first thing you do, never cross your arms in front of a crowd, never look down while you're speaking. And she said, you don't put your hands behind you don't put them back that way, you don't put them here, she said, if you do anything, you do this. She said, fig leaf position, is what she said. Get used to that. I did this for probably 10 years until like 2 years ago when I was doing this in Denver and telling this story. The AV guy came up and said, hey, people don't recommend fig leaf anymore. It doesn't. He said, it doesn't come across well on a stream. It's like the 2020s, right? So it's like, so I quit doing fig leaf and now I'm just doing this. I'm talking with my hands, doing everything I can, because I don't want to be misunderstood. As hard as it is, I want to communicate as effectively as I can all the time to as many people as possible. I was talking to one of my friends and he goes, yeah, when I stand up in front of my team, I'm always doing this because I'm, he's ex-military. And I said, oh, what do you think that says to your people? He goes, I don't know, never thought about it. And I said, well, it immediately says you're at ease, but it also says you have a military background. So what comes with that?
Commands.
Yeah. And so they have some built-in assumptions about you as a leader based on the way you're standing without you saying a word. And depending on what country they're from, they could think you're a dictator before you even said hi. And so all of that stuff matters, right? And, it took me like 10 years. I've been working on this since that first test. But last summer I assessed their entire staff and I took it again. I'm finally in the orange on the nonverbal. But it's been a long journey. Yeah, it's been intentional, disciplined, consistent effort.
Question.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how often do you retest? It almost seems like, looking at how embarrassingly bad my scores are, if I took the test tomorrow, it's almost like I know what I'm bad at, so I would subconsciously, like what is you want to see improvement.
Yeah.
You also don't want to. You want it to be genuine. You don't.
Right. That's what's important, right? This is for your personal development. Now, if I said, okay, everybody's going to test and we're going to base your salaries on your scores, everybody get 100 on that. They get the highest ones. But if you're really honest about it and you just put forth effort, it'll show the next time you take it that you are making improvement. It really will. Yeah.
I kind of put myself out there with this, but I'm kind of a lot more in the light gray, maybe like close to light gray, middle, and like I'm not surprised based on the questions that I answered, but for some reason when I was answering the questions, like I've always felt like when I'm interacting with someone from a different culture, I try not to adjust my tone or like my nonverbals because I don't want to offend people by becoming something that I'm not. And so like maybe that's part of it, but I think what you're saying is really helpful because it can be something as simple as crossing your arms in front of you.
Right.
That can make the difference for multiple cultures, not just one. And so, yeah, just thank you for clarifying some of that.
Yeah, because it doesn't mean that you start talking like, Chris Rock to Jackie Chan. Do you understand? Or whoever that was, in the movie. It's just being cognizant of all the ways that you're communicating in the moment. What was I going to share with you about that? Well, I've forgotten. It's time to quit almost anyway. So, there's a development plan you can look on your own. It's a self-paced plan. We do have steps for you. I'll talk to Eric and Angel about some things that you can keep doing for your small groups that will help you improve, especially on the action scores. there needs to be a lot of, in my opinion, training around the way you frame conversations and the way you talk about those volatile issues. I was telling your elder yesterday at Mosaix, when people join the church, they go through like 3 weeks of regular new member classes where it's vision, mission, your role, and all that. But then we require a 5-week class called Multi-Ethnic Conversations. It's a lot of this, where you go and you talk with 2 of our trained leaders on how to talk about volatile issues. You know, and it's all around race and class and just all of the messiness that's happening today. We frame the conversation, we do our best to make it really diverse so that people understand the bubble they're in or they're not in, and it helps everybody. So coming out of that, we've been doing that now, requiring that for about 3 years. And I'd say 200 to 300 people have gone through that now. And that's a big impact on the church at large. You know, when people now have that capability, and it's about training people to be winsome in the conversation so that the people coming in will want to come back and talk about it more. And that's a very, very good skill to have. So we'll talk more about that. We'll approach your leaders about all of that. Also, if you would, go and give us some feedback. Go to mosaix.info/vintagecq23 and help us with like how to make this better. You know, almost everything we've done is a result of the feedback we've gotten, and if you could go there and fill out the feedback form, that would be really, really helpful. Again, mosaix.info, vintagecq23. Lastly is this one admonition. And, you know, I told you about Amos. This is Amos. He's the one that said I had to look. He and I butted heads so much in those early days. It was horrific. I mean, we just did not understand each other. He was born in a very prominent place in Little Rock. A woman back in the 40s bought land way west of the city. Is an African American entrepreneur, way ahead of her time. She bought an island of land like 20 miles west of Little Rock, and she sold it off the little parcels to any African American family that couldn't afford to buy a house. And she developed a little neighborhood called Pankey. And that's where Amos was born. It still exists today, and it's in the heart of the wealthiest suburb of West Little Rock. You drive down this beautiful highway, and then off to the sides is this little neighborhood on both sides of this big big street, and you can tell, you know, the houses are not well kept, it's lower income. That's where Amos was born. And he and I did not understand each other at all. We were just so different. He was loud, I was reserved. He was an incredible athlete. I was the oboe player in high school, right? So I listened to oboe music, he listened to rap. He liked different foods. He was our youth pastor and was just a star. Kids, when they saw Amos walk in the room, everybody wanted to know if Amos was watching them, you know, score that basket or do whatever they were doing. He had that leadership aura. I had none of that, right? I was just like, the oboe player walked in the room and nobody cares, right? The quiet Chinese guy with the southern drawl. And so it's like we just constantly were butting heads over everything. And it got so bad, especially after that look issue, when we both went home, we were mad, and I knew that, you know, we had to come to some level of agreement just on what we were disagreeing on. We didn't know any of this stuff back in those days. We didn't have any CQ training, no books, nothing. And so I asked him to go to have lunch with me, and we just sat and talked over Mexican food. And we was like, we should at least be honest with our people about where we are with each other. And because if we can't figure this out between you and me, there's no way we can expect anybody else to do it either. And it's like, you're exactly right. I'm willing to keep trying if you are. And I said, let's keep trying, don't give up. You know, and he said, okay. And as God would have it, this is the part you need to understand, you're going to be tested every step along, every way on how much you really believe this stuff. Because that Sunday, I was up preaching, and my passage was John 13. And it's the new commandment, right? I give to you that you love one another just as I've loved you. And the first time I was studying that, all during this week, it's like, what's new about that? Certainly before, the night before Christ died, he's told his disciples to love one another. You know, that's the first time he actually taught his disciples, this is a new commandment. You're going to love each other in a way you never knew existed because you're going to love them the way I've loved you. Up until that point, he only talked about loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, loving your neighbor as yourself, loving your enemy. But he never talked about loving another disciple. Disciple to disciple love. Until the night before he died. And he said, this is a new commandment, as in put it up there with the other 10. You're going to love others, another disciple, just the way I've loved you, and by this all people will know you're my follower, by how well you can love somebody else that says I'm in them too. And so I'm studying this, just feeling so convicted. It's like, how, God, can I live this out with Amos? And I called him up on like Saturday and said, I'm studying this passage, I'm supposed to preach it, and would you be willing to come up with me during the sermon and let's just be, let's just tell everybody, let's at least be authentic about what we're trying to understand about each other. And he said, okay, I'll do that. And so I thought, okay, at least we can be authentic in our disagreement in the journey. And so I studied, got ready, and then of course, Sunday morning, it was like, okay, God, what would you do? And the answer was, I already showed you what to do. Because I looked just a few verses before that new commandment was when he washed everybody's feet. And I'm sitting there reading that and thinking, wait a minute, did he wash Judas's feet? Sure enough, he did. That was a divine moment. God had Christ wash the very person's feet that he knew would later, betray him. Because Judas didn't leave until after he had his feet washed. Which says something about what God was trying to communicate to us about that moment. And then he says, I've given you this as an example that you should also do as I've done to you. And I'm sitting there going, so are you asking me to wash Amos's feet? And I just keep coming back. I've given you this example that you should also do as I've done to you. And I just said, well, I guess I'll try it. I don't know. It's just like, you want me to wash his feet? And so I ended up, I thought, well, I'll just put it by the stage. And I said, if you really want this to happen, you're going to have to give me strength to do it. And I just didn't know what to think. But it was a very, very uncomfortable place to be. But the Sunday went on, I got up, I preached the message, I talked about the new commandment, talked about why it was new and how hard it was. And then I called and I basically said, Amos and I are from different worlds and we don't understand each other. And to be honest, we're at each other's throats and we're pastors in the same church. And then I asked Amos to come up, and he basically said, yeah, we're working as hard as we can to try to understand it, but it's really hard. And there's a lot of times we don't understand each other and we get really mad at each other. He told me later he was so mad at me because he felt like I was treating him the same way he was being treated in all his secular jobs. And he said and here I was in a church who was supposed to be doing everything for the gospel, and you felt like I was being treated the same exact way as I was by the world. And that's what made him so mad. And so when he finished, basically telling everybody, don't give up, just keep working at it, I just said, hey, Amos, stay up here with me. And I was asking Jesus how he would bridge this gap. And the only thing that came to my mind was this passage. He said, I did this for a reason, for you to do so also. And I'd like to wash your feet. And I sat him down, and the moment the water hit his feet, he calls it, what did he call it? A travailing. Amos is already really loud and boisterous, and when the water hit his feet, it was like he exploded with emotion. I mean, just deep groaning of just almost like this relief or release of all the built-in anger and frustration of all the offenses that had ever been committed against. I mean, he was wailing at such high levels of volume. And of course, I was non-expressive, so I was just weeping quietly, right? But what was amazing was out there in the congregation was unlike any noise or any sound I've ever heard in my life. It was a collective groaning and a collective weeping that was, I can't even describe it to this day. I feel like in a way that's probably the way heaven is going to be. It was just undescribable because it was grown men and women all just doing the same thing. I wish I could describe it. I wish I had a recording of it, because back then we didn't even record services, I don't think. But anyway, when we got done, everybody was a mess, not just Amos and I. And they were trying to close the service. Amos and I were on the front row, and Amos, as they were wrapping up, he put his arm around me and he said, hey, Harry, from here on out, you are my brother, and I got your back. And I mean, I don't have any explanation for what happened in that moment. I wish I could say, yeah, it was the result of 8 years of CQ testing that brought us together in understanding. It wasn't. It was the Spirit of Christ and the Holy Spirit that in that moment healed everything that we had against each other and bonded us, that to this day we are like brothers. I mean, he tells the story when he does this stuff. We try to go whenever we can together and tell the story. You know, it's just something supernatural that happened. And so when you're in those moments and you don't know what to do, and it's messy and it's hurtful and there's raw feelings, the number one thing you should do is just learn to wash another's feet. After that happened, every time there was a major church conflict, we would try honestly to literally wash feet. And every single time where it could have ended in like a church split or whole groups of people leaving, and we've done it so many times I can't even begin to tell you. And every single time it turned those really difficult places into praise and worship. One time we lost 2 elders at the same time, and it was so hurtful. It was the most tumultuous time in the entire church. The elders sent me to represent what was left of the elders to this big group of lay people, and it was as diverse as it got in the room. They all wanted to know why we were losing these godly families. And they all had their speech. One wrote a 17-page letter about largely me and my leadership. And I was so humiliated. But God had said, okay, go up and wash everybody's feet in the room. I'm like, I'm not washing anybody's feet after I heard that letter. And I was so convinced I wasn't going to do it. But as soon as he read that letter, the man of the house, which was one of the stalwarts of our church, said, thank you so much for reading that letter. We know how to pray for you. We know how to pray for this church. And then he turned to me. I didn't say a word. I wanted to rebut every paragraph of that 17-page letter in my self-righteousness, but I just bit my tongue. But then he turned to me and he said, and Harry, I want you to know I think you're one of the finest human beings I've ever met. I'm like, why would you say that? After a 17-page indictment. You know, and I was like, okay, I'll wash everybody's feet. So I washed everybody's feet, including the guy that read the letter. And as soon as the water hit every person's feet, they just busted out in tears. And halfway around the circle of about 15 people, people started worshiping God. And they started having prayer time. And then when I was done, they all sat me down and they washed my feet. And instead of it turning into like a church split, it turned into a beautiful time of worship and prayer. So when you don't know what to do, this is what it costs you. You know, this is what it costs you. And for the people that make fun of that, because we did it so much, people started making fun of it. You know, and it's like, you know, well, then the next time you're in the heat of an argument and you're really mad and you're really hurt, I dare you to try to wash the person's feet that has hurt you. Just, I dare you, try to do it and see if you can do it. You know, and that's where it really becomes real. And I don't know what it is about it, but it's why we are the way we are. So all this stuff is great to know. You can learn, you can grow, but in the end, if you don't have love, you don't have anything. Christ is what you need. And if anybody tries to convince you otherwise, you prove it that he is able. Anyway, thank you for hanging out. I didn't mean to get so emotional, but I've told that story at least 100 times, and I probably cried 95% of the time. I still don't know why. Anyway, let me pray for us, and we'll be dismissed. Lord, we thank you so much for your example. We thank you for all these tools, and we thank you that all this is just your Holy Spirit speaking truth to us that you've already shown us in your word that's everlasting and that's been your heart from the very beginning of time until the end of time, and that if we really just have the mind of Christ, the heart of Christ, that you can do so much more than what we ever hoped or thought. And so I pray that for every person in this room. I pray this group would band together and love each other and encourage each other and be a force for your kingdom unlike ever seen before. That you would use them, encourage them, sustain them, empower them, that they would love you, and that others would see the love of Christ in them, and that they would win so many people from around this community, around their campuses, to you for your name's sake. And we thank you and we love you, Lord. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. All right.
Thank you.